Hi, I'm Shannon Steimel, Library Media Specialist and Tech Committee Chair at Live for Life Academy, a charter school in St. Louis. And today I'm going to talk about protocols for effective student feedback with Google Drive and Classroom. Before becoming a librarian, I was an English teacher for years, and I also was fortunate to work in the conference writing program at Clayton. And so a lot of the tips I'm going to be sharing with you today come from that background. I also learned of a great resource over winter break this year, which is Control-Alt-Achieve. It's Eric Kurtz's website, and he gives lots of Google tips, and some of the tips I'll be sharing today are from him. So let's get started. So the first piece of advice I'd like to share is that you use Google Classroom for the easiest organization. Even if it's not something you want to use extensively, if you're using Google Drive, it's much easier to have students organize their work through Google Classroom than not. One of the things I like best about it is you can see from one screen where every kid is at. You can tell who's done or not done. You can even tell who hasn't started, for instance. You can see in this example that there's not even an attachment yet. You can also set a due date and see who turns it in on time and who is late. And then it's really easy to pop in and out of each of these students' documents in order to give them feedback, even during the class time, if that works for you. I know a lot of teachers are intimidated by Google Classroom and they think that it's doing too much. However, even just, you don't have to do an assignment ahead of time or set it up in a Google Doc to do a Google Classroom. It can be as informal as just starting an assignment, typing a simple direction like share your spooky stories, and then sharing it out with your classes. And if you do this, then the students can easily create right from this assignment that they receive, or if they already started a doc, they can add it as well to that assignment. So it makes organization super easy. So here is a really cool add-on that you can use with your Google Classroom and to get even more information about how your students are doing. So the directions are here for you if you need them later about how to do this, but let me show you basically what you would do. So you would open up a blank sheet and you would go to Add-ons and you would go to Get Add-ons. Now I already have SA Metrics, so I don't need to do this part, but I could go to Get Add-ons and just do a quick search for SA Metrics. And then once I have it added, then I'll be able to go back to add-ons and see that here it is. Then I can say that I want to get my file information from a Google Class assignment. And it's syncing with my Google Classroom, so then I'm able to easily select the class and the assignment. Sometimes it might take a minute to load the assignment. So I'm actually going to go, that's just my slow connection. It actually works pretty fast. So you would be able to click your assignment and then it would do its magic. So I actually already have it pulled up. So I'm going to go on over here to the second sheet. Give me just a sec to adjust my screen a little. So you can see this is giving me a lot of data. Now I have the columns hidden that give the student names, but it would actually be here. And so you can see the word count of how much each student has produced, which just for that information alone, it can be really helpful to be able to know where your students are without even having to jump into their documents. You can also get a lot of other information. It tells you the sentence count, the average sentence length, tells you things like how many sentences do they have without capital letters, a paragraph count, tells you when they last updated it and the number of revisions they've done. So you can get a lot of really great info from SA Metrics, and you can refresh this as often as you want to continue to track their progress. So that's a really cool add-on that you can use with Google Classroom. Okay, so there are the directions in case you need them to figure out how to go back and do that later. All right, so another thing that could be really helpful for you as far as organizing and keeping track of your students' work is to use the revision history to your advantage. So I mentioned Eric Kurtz's blog, Control-Alt-Achieve, so that he did a blog post all about tracking the writing of drafts with named versions. And so if you click on this link, it'll tell you all about it. I'll just kind of give you the brief overview. So if I go to an assignment and I go to the revision history, or actually it's called version history now, you could see I actually have an option right now to name the current version. So for instance, I could name this my final draft since I was done working on it, or if it was my rough draft, I could call it that. And then if you see, if I actually go into the version history, you can see that this is called the final draft. Now I can go back and name drafts later. So say that this was my rough draft right here on December 13th. I can go and name this version rough drafts. And so if you wanted to quickly see how the paper progressed throughout its different drafts, this is a really easy way to do that. So one other thing that you might be interested in that deals with revision history is there is a couple of things actually. So there's something called draft back that is really cool. It is something that you can add on, and it lets you see the writing in action. So instead of seeing just different versions that you have to click on, it actually turns it into a little video that shows you the students' progress as they make it. And so, especially if you're doing something like a research paper where they're going to be incorporating other ideas, if you all of a sudden see a huge chunk of writing appear, then you know that they've just copied and pasted instead of putting things in their own words. And so just showing them draft back before you get started on your research paper can sometimes cut down on that copying and pasting. But it's also just interesting to kind of see how the paper came to be. So that is called draft back. And you can find out how to add that to your Google by clicking this link. And then there's one other thing you might be interested in if you have a group project going, and that's the Revision History Analytics add-on. And that will actually give you a little pie chart of how much each person in the group contributed to that paper. So that's a way to go back and check. I wish they had this add-on for Google Slides, because a lot of times it's group presentations rather than a group paper that's being submitted, but it's not available yet. So whoever is the maker out there, they need to keep this in mind and get that going for us. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is pacing. So probably the best piece of advice that I can give you today is to make sure that you build in adequate drafting time in the process for feedback. If you are waiting until the first draft is complete to even begin commenting, then you waited too long. Think about if I'm writing a paper where I have to incorporate quotes properly with citations and giving it context and then giving explanation, and I've been doing that incorrectly for 3 body paragraphs, I'm going to be much more open to making revisions on that if you catch that in the first body paragraph when I have time just to fix that, and then I can continue on correctly, than I am once I have my whole rough draft finished and now you're telling me that I've done it all wrong. So as far as how to make the time for feedback, it's going to depend on your personal style. Some people feel very comfortable with having the kids drafting in class and they're at their computer jumping in and out of different drafts, giving the kids feedback. Of course, that can be a management issue. So the other option is to build in time to give them comments asynchronously. So, you know, instead of having them type the whole rough draft, maybe just have them type the intro and first body paragraph, and then have time for you, you know, at home or on your plan or whatever, to give them feedback through comments, and then they have to respond to those feedback or that feedback and those comments before they get to keep moving on with their draft. So that's definitely something to think about as you're planning your revision. Another thing that this pacing allows you to do is to seize teachable moments to coach the class. So they're in the middle of their drafts and they're not finished yet, and so you start a class by saying, so-and-so has a great intro, let's check it out. And then you actually go to Google Classroom and pull that up and read that intro together and talk about what they did well. You know, maybe you're not sure who has a good example, but there's a skill you've been working on and you want to find out who feels like they have an example they want to share. So we've been working on giving context to our quotes, who has a strong example to share, and then you would get a volunteer and go in and take a look at how they're doing. Maybe the kids are struggling with something like adding in transitions from their thesis statement, from their hook to their thesis statement, and so you would actually just ask for a volunteer, like who's struggling, who would like some help, and then you can pull up their paper and have the class read it and offer suggestions. This also works great for things like quick edits, and so you know, you just ask for a volunteer who wants to take a paragraph and let's look at sentence fragments and run-ons and make those corrections. Or if you are going to have your kids do a peer feedback, you could model a strategy for peer feedback with them on the screen, asking for volunteers for that before you set them loose to give peer feedback. So these are just a few examples of how you can seize teachable moments and use the kids' work to guide your feedback that you're giving them in class. But you've got to build that time in order to be able to do this. One thing I would suggest as well as you complete an assignment is to start a folder or folders of good examples. So for instance, maybe no one in your class has a good or great intro yet, and so you want to show them an example. Well, if you've saved one from the last time you did the assignment, then you might be able to use that. Or even if it was a great intro from something else, it might still be helpful to them. So the easiest way to do this is just to make a copy of the file itself and store it in a folder on your drive, and you can organize those by assignment or example type. I do definitely suggest taking off identifiable information and also making sure to note why you saved that if it's not already evident by the way you organized it, because you may not remember later what it was a good example of. So I would do that in the file name so that it's really easy to see and pull up once you have it organized. If you don't have any great examples yet, or you haven't thought to start saving them, I do have a link here that you might be interested in that has the top 10 places to get mentor text, so you could check that out. Released items from state testing are also a great place to look for mentor items, especially if you're looking for either exemplars or poor writing that you want to improve. And I also mentioned peer feedback strategies, and so Read, Write, Think from NCTE has a great strategy guide on that, and so you could check it out. So let's talk about the feedback that we give our students. I want you to think about, are your comments the digital equivalent of bleeding on the page? Consider what this type of feedback actually is teaching them. What it's teaching them is that they are not capable of doing good work on their own, and only a teacher can fix it, and they pretty much stink at writing is how they're going to feel when they get a paperback like this. So let's talk about what we would do instead to give them some great feedback. Here are my top suggestions. First of all, you definitely want to build on success, and so make sure to let them know where they have made effective choices, help them identify that. You want to make sure to meet the students where they are. So you might see a lot of problems that you want to address, but trying to address 10 things, even 5 things at one time is too much. And so you really want to think about improving writing as a marathon and not a sprint. So, you know, it's hard to let go of some errors and not correct everything, but you've really got to do that if you want them to not feel overwhelmed by your feedback. So pick the one thing that's going to help them grow as a writer today. And then my last piece of advice is be careful not to let surface level mistakes become the focus. It's really easy to mark them, but if you do that, first of all, if you mark it every time, they're not going to learn how to catch those mistakes themselves. And also, you know, it just becomes overwhelming. So what's an error that you can point out once that they've made several times, and you can make sure to explain how to look for that, and then expect them to then find the other and correct the other errors like that in their paper. That's my best suggestion. Another thing you can think about too is think about rounds of comments. And so maybe on the first time that you're commenting on something, especially if it's a longer assignment, you're focusing just on 1 or 2 things, and then maybe on a second go around, you're focusing on something else, maybe the specific skills that you've been teaching. And then the third time, you are giving them some grammar tips and polishing pieces. Now, you know, you may not have time to go in and comment 3 different times on every student's drafts, but think about the time it takes you to make a couple of suggestions on one draft versus trying to correct everything on a rough draft. It really is going to be much easier to do that, and you get kind of in the same mode of, okay, this is what I'm looking for in all these papers, and you can get through them much faster. Last summer, I went to a great conference, and this guy is like the king of feedback. So if you ever want to know more about giving effective feedback, not just on writing, but in general, he is the guy to go to. And he talks a lot about descriptive feedback. And so the idea is that instead of telling them that they did well or did poorly, you're talking about commenting on the decisions that they've made and what the impact of those decisions were. So that's something to think about as you're making your comments. He also noted that the best feedback comes when you give them comments alone. And so, you know, you may be tempted to tell them what their grade would be on the rough draft if they turned it in now. But if you do that, they're going to focus on the grade and not on the feedback. So that's something definitely to keep in mind as you are working on giving them that feedback. Let's talk about the methods of commenting. So there are 2 distinct methods of commenting in Google Docs. One is the comment box, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Something that's a little bit newer is suggesting mode, and that's where you turn on suggesting mode, and then you can actually comment in the document, and then they can either accept your suggestion and then it becomes part of the paper, or they can reject it if they want to make a different change. So let's take a quick look at what that would look like. So if I turn on suggesting mode, it's up here with the little pencil icon. And then I turn it on, and now I can see if I make any corrections in the piece, it's going to be in a different color. So if I say, oh, I have 2 is's here, so I actually want to get rid of this is. And so you can see that it deletes it in green, and then it gives them a comment box that tells them you should get rid of this. And they can go in later and accept it, and then it becomes part of the paper. Now, when you're in suggesting mode, you still can do regular comments. That is a possibility. So you don't have to switch back and forth in between. You can actually just do a comment like you normally would. So that is the difference between those 2. What I would think about is use suggesting mode when you are either suggesting grammatical changes for them, or, you know, maybe they have an awkward phrasing and you want to make a suggestion of how they could fix it, and they know that they can either accept that or they can reject and then try their own wording. Sometimes like trying to explain in a comment exactly what you mean by how it's awkward or how you could fix it is confusing and may not actually help them. And so sometimes it's easier just to show them in the document. And of course, as long as you don't overuse it. But it is pretty intrusive to actually be making changes within their document. So you do want to use it sparingly. And I would say for the most part, you're going to stick to the normal comment box whenever you're making comments. Next, I'd like to give you 4 time-saving tips for those comment boxes and what you can do with them. So the first thing we'll talk about is flipping your comments to use videos to help show them how to correct the errors in their papers. The next idea is instead of typing all of your comments, you can actually leave voice comments, and there's 2 ways that you can do that. A third option is if you feel like you're always making the same comments over and over again, you can actually keep a bank of frequent comments that could be accessed easily through Google Keep, and I'll show you what I mean by that. And then the last thing is if you really miss giving written comments on an electronic document, you can actually do that through the Classroom app if you have a tablet or a phone that makes it able for you to write on. So I'll show you that as well. Okay, so flipping your comments. So I don't know if you know this, but if you copy and paste a URL into a comment box, it actually turns into a hot link. And so they can click on it and it will take them there. So for instance, if you notice that a student is having trouble with writing a conclusion, you could just find a quick video about how to write conclusions and copy and paste that for them. What I suggest is that you create your own little playlist of the videos that you like for some of the different topics. That's pretty easy to do in YouTube. And if you want a place to start, you know, I just do Google searches for YouTube videos that have what I'm looking for. There's really no reason to reinvent the wheel. But here is a link to 10 best YouTube channels for writing teachers. So that might be a good place to look to if you're looking for some good videos. So if you want to make your own videos, you can do that, and I suggest using Screencastify. One easy way to do that is to create a PowerPoint, or excuse me, a slideshow that covers what you're going to talk about, and then you just page through the slides and discuss it like I'm doing actually right now with this slideshow. Then the other really cool thing that you can do with something like Screencastify is if you want to be able to point at what you're talking about with your comments instead of, and you know, explain it with your voice instead of typing them out, you could do that with Screencastify as well. So say that I'm in the document and I want to make a little screencast. If I was in Chrome, I could use that extension for Screencastify and pull it up, and I could actually say, you know, in your first paragraph here, I really like how you do this, but you know, I also noticed that you need to develop this idea a little bit more. And so you're talking and explaining. You don't have to have the video on if you don't want to. And then once you have that little video, then you can put the link for it in a comment box related to whatever that is, or just at the top of their paper if you're covering everything. So that's a quick way to give them some voice comments in their document. And then another way to leave voice comments is called voice notes, and that's part of a Google Chrome extension called Read and Write. Read and Write actually has quite a few different tools, as you can see here, but voice note is here on the end. And if you want to know more about how to use that, if you go to Eric Kurtz's blog post, option 2 is on voice notes, and you can read all about the directions. He explains it really well. So I mentioned that you might want to use Google Keep to keep a bank of frequent comments, and you can see an example here. Let me show you actually what this would look like in the paper as well. So I cancel out that comment box for a minute. I go up here to Tools and I go to Keep Notepad. It brings up my Google Keep Notepad, and you can see one of my notes here is frequent comments from writing. And so then I can go in here and copy these and then paste it into a comment box pretty easily then for the writing. So I would just highlight and insert my comment, and then I can just paste that comment right in there. That works if you are finding yourself typing the same thing over and over again to students. And so Google Keep is really easy to use. You just make little notes for yourself and type those up so you can kind of keep a running list of different comments that you have. And if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, this teacher actually has all of her comments that she shared out that she uses a lot, and you can click on this and see more of those. And then I mentioned the last type of comment that you might want to try is to do the handwritten comments by using the Google Classroom app. And if you want to know that, that's actually option 4 on that same blog post that I just mentioned from Eric Kurtz. So you should definitely check that out. So the last thing I want to talk about is assessment. So one thing I thought was interesting from this book about going gradeless is that self-assessment is actually has one of the highest effect sizes of any intervention. And so are you thinking about, like, what can you do to get your kids assessing their own writing and not just waiting for your comments and feedback? So Eric Kurtz, the hero of the day for this screencast, he actually has a whole blog post that has tips from him on different tools that you can use for self-editing, so you could check those out. And then another thing you can think about is having them self-reflect with a rubric. So instead of giving them the rubric with the scores on it from you, you can give them the rubric and have them evaluate themselves, and then you can say whether you agree or not. Now there are some automated rubrics that they've gotten that you can use, and I haven't actually explored these very much. Orange Slice looked pretty promising to me, and that's why I listed it first. But I'm not sure if any of these actually let the kids give their self-reflection first, or if it's all just teacher-driven. But you know, one simple thing you can do is if you have a scoring guide anyway or a rubric, you can just copy and paste it into the initial assignment that you give kids. Do a page break and put it on page 2, and then it'll be there waiting for when you're ready to give them feedback. Just don't forget to have them unshare with any peers that they've gotten feedback from before you start to fill in that grade for them. So those are my tips for you of how you can give effective feedback and the protocols you should use to do that with using Google Drive and Google Classroom. Happy writing, and thanks for listening.